Welcome to the Korea Society's Arts and Culture program. So for many young readers, being able to see themselves reflected in the books they read is a profound experience. Tonight, we are thrilled to join in the conversation between the two creators about the many different layers of consideration, introspection, and deliberation that go into conceiving and writing picture books, and the importance of humor and diversity in children's literature. Francis Cha is the author of the novel If I Had Your Face, which was named one of the best books of the year by Time Magazine, NPR, BBC, and Esquire, among other publications, and is being translated into 11 languages. Her children's book is The Goblin Twins, just published by Crown Books for Young Readers. Aram Kim is art director at Macmillan Children's Publishing Group, an award-winning writer and illustrator of children's picture books such as Cat on the Bus, the series Yumi Friends and Family, which includes No Kimchi for Me, Let's Go to Taekwondo, and Sunday Fun Day in Koreatown, and her latest book, Tomorrow is New Year's Day. She is recipient of the 2022 Mills Tannenbaum Award for Children's Literacy. You'll have your own chance to ask your questions to Francis and Aram later this evening. If you're joining us via live webcast, you can send your questions via email, artsandculture@koreasociety.org. And Francis and Aram will also be signing a copy of their books after the program, and we'd like to thank Books of Wonder for handling the sales tonight. Once again, if you're joining us online, they are available wherever books are sold, including the website of Books of Wonder. And now please welcome Francis Cha and Aram Kim.
Hello. Thank you to the Korea Society for having us. It's a dream stage to be here talking about picture books, which we're so obsessed with and could talk about forever.
Yeah, and you've seen me like keeping clicking on the screen and it wasn't moving. Peter, the slide is not moving. Can you help us? Oh, there we go. Thank you for joining us today. Like Francis was so nice to keep this event as our both events, but then we are actually here to celebrate the Goblin Twins that just came out that I'm very, very excited about. So these Goblin Twins, when I heard about this book coming out and by Francis Cha, who is an author of If I Had Your Face, which I devoured, and there's like one copy left in the back, so you need to run to it if you want to get a copy to be signed. When I heard that she was having a children's book out and Jamie Kim, who is one of my favorite illustrators, was working on it, I was really excited. So could you talk a little bit about the Goblin Twins for us?
Yes. So thank you, Adam. The Goblin Twins is a picture book, and I was so excited to kind of pitch a story that I wished I could bring to my children's school or a child's birthday party that introduces some parts of Korean folklore that are not well known outside of Korea, but also have it be interesting for people who are familiar with Korean folklore as well. So I think that's, as a writer, that's something that we constantly think about, how to make something interesting and how to make something new. And I took the liberty of doing that this time around with a children's book. And originally, I had been writing a very, very dark story about dokkaebi for an adult horror novel. And I had done a lot of research. It was sparked by a family story that I overheard my mother and my uncle talking about. They grew up across the street from a family that was rumored to serve a dokkaebi, and that had brought them incredible wealth and calamitous ruin. And that conversation, which I eavesdropped on, just sparked my imagination as a writer. I really couldn't believe it. And the more research that I did into the concept of dokkaebi, I discovered so many fascinating facets of the folklore and the dichotomy of kind of the horror element for adults and the very mischievous element of goblin tricksters in the children's side of folklore. So while I was writing my adult book, of course, procrastination came, and I started thinking, oh, I want to write a children's book. And so many things came together, and this finished itself first.
So does that mean that we are going to see your adult novel about dokkaebis later?
Oh, well, we'll see about that.
Okay, we will see about that. So your first not picture book, first book, If I Had Your Face, was such a huge success, and it was really well accepted. And so you already said that you were researching dokkaebi for your other novel, but then you came to a realization that it could be a children's book. Was there another reason that you were inspired to write children's book after writing adult novel?
I think having two young children who are here with me tonight, they are voracious readers and constantly keeping up with them, introducing new books to them. And you see, it's a lot of the books that I loved so much as a child sometimes don't age well. They have a lot of concepts that are embedded that are kind of outdated now, even from very basic concepts like, oh, the good characters have golden hair and the bad characters have black hair, very things like that have kind of been embedded into tales. And of course, I had the 욕심, the desire to bring the culture in as well. So yeah, so many different reasons. I could go on forever about it. But writing for adults and writing for children, of course, is such a different discipline. But at the same time, I approached it. We talk about it a lot in fiction workshops as well, but it's all down to character and what character desires, what choices they make, kind of how to get them to step outside of their comfort zone and to be tortured by their plot and go into unfamiliar spaces.
I
which
really
is the
love these
same.
characters, Toki and Gaby, by the way. I really love them. How did you feel? Like, what did you think of them when you saw the illustrations of this first that Jamie did?
Oh my
Because,
gosh.
like, Tokebi can
Yeah.
be really different, many shapes, right?
So Jamie was on my, I have been talking to Phoebe, my editor, about Jamie for a long time. And it's, as someone who can't draw a stick figure to save my life, when our first sketches came back, my jaw was just on the floor. And my favorite picture books, I think that's the magic of picture books, that the words only bring half of it, and the illustrations tell the other half that you really cannot convey with words. And Jamie, what she does to, all the little details that she puts in really. And she was born in Korea, came to the States when she was 18, very familiar with the folklore, very familiar with, modern picture books. She's such a successful illustrator. So she was just incredibly intuitive about a lot of the choices that she made as an illustrator, but it was also fun for me to kind of give her, sounding boards of what to go off of. For example, with the cover, which we talked about a lot after she came back with it first, was I love the idea of modernity. Seoul today is such an immediate visual contrast of old and new, and having a 정자, the what do you call it in English? I guess I don't know, pagoda is the Japanese term, but 정자 in Korean, and having Namsan Tower in the back and the plane, as well as actually bats have a really old meaning in Korean culture and history that is very different from the Western symbolism. Bats historically have been symbols of fortune, good luck, prosperity. So a lot of the research trips that I did in Korea, you would see the bat motif in furniture, in like a lot of the imagery in temples as well. So it was so fascinating to see the different symbols come in and signify different things in one one story.
Yeah, I really like seeing that Namsan Tower on the cover of the book. That is such an iconic landscape of Seoul. So I love these characters, and I grew up with dokkaebi, the tricksters, goblins, when I was in Korea as a kid. Why did you set this story specifically into cities, Seoul and New York City? I was just curious.
Yeah, I mean, we'll go into it more, but I think, oh, and this is the end papers, which I actually want to talk to you about as an art director, but the end pages introducing the book. So we start out in Seoul, and then the the very last pages are New York. So again, we have the same elements of bats, but they are signifying different things. And this was just such a joy for me to kind of a gift because that this is all Phoebe and Jamie, my editor and my illustrator. They did their magic. This is not, the writer has no say in this. And discovering all the Easter eggs that are embedded in there. They have a ghost neighbor, and bringing this incredible setting to life was just visually, I love that contrast between very modern Seoul, very modern New York. Um,
Can I
yeah,
just also add that I really love that parallel elements of the front and end.
as an art director,
So on the front end paper, you see like dokkaebi, these goblins in Seoul, and then this like the castle from 14th century combined with this like very modern high-rise buildings, which is always amazing to see. But at the very end, you also see a very similar things of Central Park, like really beautiful nature right in the middle of the city. So like very different cities, but very like similar elements conveyed. I think that was really, really smart and wonderful. These are
oh,
one
well,
of my favorite
kudos
parts of
to
the book.
Jamie and Phoebe for that. So we open with going back to the characters, two twins who are very different in personality. One is very extroverted. You can tell which one it is. He's a trickster. He loves to play pranks and scare people. The other twin is loves reading, introverted, stays at home, and I wonder if you can guess which one I was. So it's kind of based on my brother, my little brother, who was very extroverted. Whenever he came to my school, people would say, "Oh, wow, you guys are related." It was wild that we had the same parents actually. But oh, sorry, just to go back. Uh, but just starting off with two different characters and two different desires. One wants to go out and play pranks, one wants to stay home and read. And that's kind of the beginning of story because it's the beginning of character and desire. So that's how I approached it from a storyline perspective. So I wanted to Aram, by the way, I encountered Aram obviously through her incredible works. We have so many of her books at home that my kids and I have read. And I did not know that you were the art director of Macmillan Children's Books until very recently because we just knew you as an author illustrator. So this is just so fascinating to me how you really know the entire how the sausage is made from beginning to end, from the writing to the illustrating, and then all the details that go into the art direction. So could you talk about your journey and where you kind of derive inspiration as a writer and an illustrator?
Yeah, I think I was really drawn to the Goblin Twins because how that tricksters that I grew up with are actually set in Korea and New York City, which I resonated a lot with. So I really love like seeing that very familiar Korean culture in the city that where I'm living right now. So when I was actually when I was putting up this slide, I was actually putting up a slide for the inspiration for the book that I wanted to talk about, which is Sunday Fun Day in Koreatown. But then I think this actually kind of works for my journey as an art director and also author illustrator as well. I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, while my family lived for 7 years there, but they moved back to South Korea when I was 2. So I don't remember any of those. And I grew up there, went to school, and I wasn't thinking of coming back to the States until I became an adult. I think the reason I came to the States was because I always loved drawing and writing and reading as a kid. And I wanted to be a writer and the artist. And I think it's not only in Korea. I think a lot of people in many different countries will feel the same way. But being an artist didn't feel like a viable career option to survive in the world. I think that was especially true in Korea because their education system is a little more rigid. So I wasn't thinking of it, but then when I came to the States for a year as an exchange student when I was in college, I started taking art classes for fun. And then it was just mind-blowingly fun that I just had to keep doing. So that's why I moved to New York City after I became an adult. And that's actually the drawing that I did on the year that I moved to the New York City. Like anyone who moved internationally knows that this is all you can carry on a flight to move your life from one country to the other. Like 2 giant bags and then like 1 backpack and a laptop. So that's what I drew to kind of like record that moment when I moved. And that's my dad and me as a kid in the States. And I actually put it up there because Sunday Fun Day in Koreatown was inspired by those 2 moments in a way. So one of my favorite childhood memory was spending a lot of time with my dad on Sundays because that was my dad's only day off when I was a kid. And then also this one of my favorite memory as an adult when I came to New York City, it was before the smartphone era. So I didn't even know that there was a Koreatown in New York City, which is like right nearby of the Korea Society. I was just walking around the city a lot and I just ran into that block and that just blew my mind. So that was one of my favorite adulthood memories. And this is actually the combination of those 2 memories. Oh my God, thank you. So, I will leave it there. So, yeah, so I came to New York City and then went to school and started making books. And these were the books that I made. But then for your question, I actually started working in a publishing company because I was trying to get my book published as an author and illustrator, and I wanted to get behind the curtain to find out all the secrets and then get my books published. So I started working in the publishing company, but then it was actually a lot more fun than I imagined because I got to work with these amazing illustrators. I get to see the art every day, all day, and then also I get to work with all these different teams in the company like editorial team, production team, like copy editing team, which is so fun. And then it does make me realize it's a very, very collaborative process. It's not one person job. So it really fascinated me and I stayed. So that's how I came to be.
So, I mean, it's very interesting because you have the perspective of the writer, the illustrator, and the art director beyond the line, and it's and as a writer who is pitching stories, and my students are always so curious how to get beyond the line of publication. So I do want to talk about some differences between what you kind of the iterations of story in relation to your books in the past. So can you talk a bit about that?
Definitely. So this one, so Sunday Funday in Koreatown came out in 2021. And Nadi Sunday Walk with Daddy was the early version of that book that I worked on in 2014 with my mentor and teacher, Pat Cummings. And and that was before I started working in a publishing company. So I had very naive approach to children's books. So it so there were many years in between these two, and there are a lot of similarities that stayed, but also there are a lot of differences that became different, which actually the slides are later, so I will talk about it a little later.
And can you talk a little bit about process, how you go about
Definitely. Yeah, so
illustration?
like you talked about drawing stick figures. And as you see here, maybe you can see, maybe you cannot, but then I start with stick figures. But then my characters are cats, so these are like cat stick figures. So it has the ear, but that's all it has. So I start really rough, and then I like them like laid out all in one page, because that way you see the flow of it from the beginning to the end. If you have like how many pages of the full spread, if you see how many pages of single pages, if like the pagination is working. So yeah, so I start with this one, and then I go like refine them again and again and again. And then
So would you say you start with the writing first or the illustration first? Or are they
right,
really
like
together?
when you ask me that question, the first I was like, oh, like what's my answer? Um,
So
and I still can't tell
is it
because
all holistic?
yeah, I think they all come together simultaneously. But a lot of times the story comes first, but that doesn't mean that I write first. I have a story that I want to tell, and then I start writing, but also drawing at the same time. And the drawing is this rough. So it just go like hand by hand. And then because I actually wanted to talk about your research process to make a book, I said I will talk about my research first, and then I will ask you. So I barely did any research for Sunday Funday in Koreatown, because for other books I did, but then for this book, I think it's really about what I loved and what I knew, what I was familiar with.
Memories.
Right.
Yeah.
So I really didn't need to do much research. But then I think like one research I did was actually the architecture of a grandma who is one of the main characters of the book, because in my head, the story was set in Queens, where I live right now. I really like my neighborhood, very like cozy, and I love seeing these like little houses on my block that has a tiny piece of land that grows vegetables, like a really tiny piece, but everyone is growing vegetables, and I really love that. So I was kind of like finding those houses and drawing them, because I wanted the house to be something that like my grandma would be able to manage like by herself. So that's the most research I did on my sketchbook. And I did some other like character studies. I love the rooster hairstylist that's in my Koreatown spread if you want to look for it later. But that's that. And I want to hear about your research process, because I'm sure that's different, which will come out after a few of these.
Oh, well, we can go back to that. So when the biggest 아쉬운 점 about the biggest the point that I was really not upset about, but I wish I could have brought to my adult novel is the fact that you don't have any visuals other than the cover. And when I was writing a book about Korea, everyone in it is Korean, operating in Korean language in Korea, but I couldn't really put in any visuals. Obviously, you'd have to do it through your writing. But because we don't have a precedent of a lot of concepts, it's kind of difficult to describe. For example, a Hanok house, and the concepts of maru, the concepts of inside, outdoors is very different, and how to incorporate it subtly in context versus just it would be so easy if you have a visual, right? So that was one of the things that killed me when I was writing my adult book, and I was so excited to do have the visual component tell another half of the story with the children's book. And this is one of the places I write in Seoul. And again, I love looking out of over Seoul and seeing, I mean, you can't really see it, but this Seoul-song, which the fortress wall that figures largely in the end pages, you can see that because it goes throughout Korea, and as well as the skyscrapers. And, it's such a modernity meets tradition type of landscape that is very inspiring as a writer to be looking at. In terms of research, so these are some of the images that I pitched to both, or as background images when I was first talking about the book to my agent and to editors when we would have calls about the book. And just to explain the concept of dokkaebi, because it doesn't exist in Western culture. Although if you do some research, there are similar strains of similar concepts in Russian literature, actually. And I discovered I did so much research in terms of academic papers. Like research is the ultimate procrastination for writers, and I could, have spent the next 10 years researching dokkaebi. So I would go to the library and look up academic journals in Korean, and those deal a lot with the history and the dichotomy of the two different strains of how dark their stories can be or how light their stories can be. But historically, in terms of visual motifs, for example, the Three Kingdoms period, which is really where it was very prevalent, a lot of the images were exorcism art. So they're kind of tricksters and they can bring ruin, but they also guard against the three major kind of disasters that people were concerned with at the time, and unfortunately are still very true today, which is wind and flooding and fire. So a lot of these temples and palaces would have tiles with dokkaebi imagery on them to ward against terrible disasters befalling on them. But in these one-off stories and folk tales, if a wayward bad actor would come across them, then they would be punished. So they have a very multifaceted nature, which I love exploring as characters. That's what you want and I kind of divided those, the good versus the bad into the two twins, actually. So just going off of some prompts that I would ask Phoebe to give to Jamie. And the dokkaebi are 600 years old. They're babies. That's the first line of the book. All the dokkaebi think they're babies because they're only 600 years old. And in those 600 years, they've seen a lot of kings come and go. So this was one of the fun storylines exemplifying one of the pranks. But furniture, again, I could also do a whole thing on furniture, but that would sound very boring. Furniture is, if you study furniture, it really is looking at how Korean families are structured, how Korean society was structured. History is embedded in all the motifs. But I would give a visual clue being like, oh, can we have a seja, which is the prince, be scared? Because that would be the ultimate person to scare in all of Korea, and the one person who should not be scared. So of course I made them cross the line, and so Gebi is sneaking into the palace for a scare. Another visual that this was so fun to just scout places within the context of dokkaebi and kind of put my take on a storyline on different landmarks that I love. So this is Seollung. Again, you see the immediate visual of ancient versus modernity in one incredible image. So this is a Joseon Dynasty king, Seongjong, royal tomb. And one of my dear family friends has a house right in front of there, so I see this all the time. And dokkaebi are famous for living in abandoned houses or in graveyards because this is sort of the darker side, but I don't know if kids are listening, but there would be dokkaebi pul, kind of when the gas escapes from decomposition, they would cause phosphorescence, and that would be attributed to dokkaebi in ancient times. So that's why people thought dokkaebi lived in the cemetery. So when Toki and Gebi get evicted from their house, which is being turned into a mall, a lot of the Tokebi decide to go live in the royal tomb, and they go elsewhere. These two decide, oh, they've heard of a faraway land where people actually like to be scared. So they've heard of the concept of Halloween. And one of them is pushing to go, the other one doesn't want to go. But these are examples of other visuals that I would send to Phoebe and Jamie about kind of settings. So this is a Joseon Dynasty Shijang, a market, and this is a 1950s. I love taking like visual scenes from different eras of Korean history. So this is the 50s, and this is coming up in the second book, sneak peek, where there's a scary scene that happens in the 50s. And so a lot of the Toki's adventures occur within the pages of a book. Like me, growing up, moving around a lot, books were always how I found solace and escapism. And for Toki, it's the same, but he's really bound by just reading at home. So that's, and I wanted this to be kind of 동양화, the Korean, traditional Korean art. And what Jamie, she did so many takes on this, and it kills me that I can't have them all in the book because they're so beautiful. And maybe I'll ask Jamie if we can share the other takes on those. But anyways, that's kind of going off tangent. And yes.
Can I just say that I would love to hear about your lecture on the furniture later at some point because I think that
no one else would be interested.
I think it would be really, really fun. And Korean furnitures are very, very like thoughtfully made with all the symbolism embedded in it. So it would be really fun to hear about it. And I also want to kind of point out that when I was reading this book, what I really loved about it was also, so you were mentioning Toki being introverted and Gebi being more extroverted. And because I'm introverted too, I kind of like already think, oh, like introverted ones are the thoughtful ones. But then here, like Toki is thoughtful, but then there is a section that Gabby is so thoughtful when he is looking for the new home for both of them. It was like one of my favorite plays to read. Like, so you should all read it and then find out.
But going back to what we were talking about, different iterations and what you were talking about earlier.
Right. So this one that I worked on in 2014. So there is so the main character in this early version, her name was Nari. So Nari is making kimbap for breakfast on Sundays. It's like her favorite thing to do. And on Sunday Fun Day in Koreatown, after almost 10 years, there is kimbap in the story, but then she cannot make it for breakfast because they ran out of rice. So that kind of difference actually kind of like lived like throughout the story. So in my very early version, Nari is literally just having a great day, like great time on Sundays. But as I learned more and more about the storytelling, which I also want you to talk about it later, like the
conflict,
right? The conflicts,
right,
exactly.
the progression of plot,
right?
That's why the previous version was not quite there, and this version, other than the difference of cat protagonist, that's really where the biggest difference lies. Conflict.
Exactly.
Right?
Francis
Yeah.
teaches creative writing, by the way. So this is something to keep in mind if you're a writer. So yeah, the conflicts was the main thing, main different. So yeah, a lot of elements stay the same, but in different way in this like the book that came out later. And then also, I wanted to talk about something that I say all the time to the illustrators that I work with. So, this is a spread from Sunday Funday in Koreatown. And right in the middle of the book, it's called a gutter. And then I always say like the 50% of the comments that I give to the illustrator is like move things away from the gutter, move things to the left, move things to the right so that they are not in the gutter. Because illustrators work flat. No matter you work digitally or you work on a piece of paper, we work flat. But then when you are making that into a book, in the middle of the book, that gets bound and it gets lost a little bit in the middle. So,
My editor is nodding.
right, it's like a main comments that we
Right.
always give.
So this was, I think Aram put this in because one of the main questions I asked when I first met her and since then is how does being an art director affect your own work as an illustrator and a writer? And this was one of the main examples that she gave.
Right, right. So when I was working on this spread, it looks like everything was not very complicated, but I worked very carefully so that nothing falls into the gutter. So no characters into the gutter, no signs into the gutter. So I'm very proud of this spread. And the teacher that I mentioned earlier, Pat Cummings, she once told me that she shows this spread to her students. I was so I was so excited and proud of myself. So anyways, so that's one thing that I like tell the illustrators when we talk about, but also
Because as a reader, I often encounter books where
like, oh,
you're
what's
just like,
in
oh
it?
no, what happened?
Right, right. So it feels very minor, but then when you look at it as a
It
book,
disrupts the story.
yeah. So it's so that's something that I tell the illustrators. But working as an art director in a publishing house is actually really, really, really like amazing training for me because I actually put up some of the covers that I worked on.
So this is just a shocking list of books that Aram has been working. You know, she is an incredible art director of all these incredible books, and I couldn't believe it when I saw her list because they were books that I was very familiar with and revered. And she has not only worked on them as an art director, but she has her own other career as a writer illustrator.
I like to hide my identity as an art director, but I mean, I shouldn't because I am really honored to work with these really amazing illustrators. And I really feel like that's the best training that I get as an author illustrator because I am really inspired, like seeing their process. And everyone's process is so different, and seeing how they resolve, like to tell the stories, how they make the images. And that actually got me trained to look at my work a little more objectively too. And if you write or illustrate, you know that it's really hard to look at your work objectively because you're so attached to it. But yeah, like I feel like now I am a little better looking at it more objectively because when I see my work, then I ask myself if this is the work that was sent to me by the illustrator that I work with, what would I say? Like, what kind of feedback would I give? Then that really helped me, like, refine my work. So, speaking of a career outside of writing and illustrating our own books, you also teach, as we mentioned, creative writing. And can you share any tip that you share with your students that you also keep in mind, but also you can share with us?
So I think as writers, what we really struggle with is when our characters become very passive and it's hard to kind of push them into uncomfortable territory. And that's actually where story begins, when they are pushed to do something out of their comfort zone, but it's still in line with their kind of their personality and how, and they don't know what will happen and we don't know what will happen, and that's the suspense that keeps a reader reading. So that's what we talk about a lot in workshop. And this slide I chose because I think this is not only one of my favorite, I think the favorite illustration from the book for me, but it also symbolizes that moment of really taking the leap for these characters, which is when they go to New York. So that again is bringing these characters not only out of their country, but also really into somewhere that no one has ever seen them before, which is New York City. But it is in line with what they're seeking, what their desire, which is, and Gibby is leading the way because he wants to go see a place where people like to be scared and people like to dress up to scare other people. So that was kind of merging the two kind of cultural elements and bringing them into a new storyline, which was very, very fun for me. And what they do is they go around New York City, they try to discover an abandoned house in New York for them to live in, and kind of in line with the dokkaebi's way of thinking, but applied to New York City. And we'll see what happens after that. I won't give it away.
And also, I like this scene because that's something that everyone who lives in New York would be kind of familiar with, right? We leave the city and then we come back, and when we come back in a plane, don't we like look out the window and there's like, oh, like we are back. Like I really like that
magical
feeling.
spread
Yeah.
of New York unfolding in front of us. And as a writer, by the way, it's nothing more magical than to give over these lines, just a few lines, and see this magic that comes back from the illustrator. I mean, it was just beyond, and Phoebe knows how much I rave about this particular scene. And I mean, even from the first sketches to the finished art, there was such a leap that I didn't expect as a debut picture book writer. And that was just, I mean, I'm still not over it. So, but from a storytelling perspective, this in the middle of the book is the most important, kind of crossing the boundary.
So if you are writing, then making a decision to transition is an important turning point of your writing. So I really love Toki and Gabi. Do we get to see them again in another book after this, or are you working on your other novel of scary dokkaebi?
So funny you should ask, but this is a sneak preview of the second book, which is coming next fall. But I also chose this particular spread because, again, I think it exemplifies the back and forth between the writer and the illustrator, and of course the editor bringing her expertise into it. But we have a lot of jokes, and a lot of what my focus was how to make every single step funnier, every single joke, next level. And this time we went back and forth between, should we leave it as, Gibby is up to no good again, and he's trying to come up with very scary tricks. So these are just joke after joke after joke that I'm trying to write. Turn Central Park into Jurassic Park. Bring back King Kong. And is it funnier as a visual representation, which Jamie interpreted as art, or is it funnier just written out as words? So we've been kind of going back and forth and deciding what's the best interpretation to bring for the maximum impact of joke.
I think that really is a beauty of working on picture books, that you can really work to decide, like, should that be in a text? Should that be in a picture? Like, what is more effective way to convey what you want to convey? I really love that very tight collaboration between the author and illustrator. And can you share the title of this book, or is that a secret?
Yes, it's tentatively titled Goblin Twins, Too Hard to Scare.
Too Hard to Scare.
Yes, and it's all about New Yorkers being very jaded.
We can all relate to that.
And
Yeah.
I love my favorite picture books also have that dichotomy of jokes for the adults reading it over and over, and they get so sick of reading the same book over and over. So there are some jokes in it on that level. And then, of course, jokes for the children who delight in the more, obvious child joke as well. So that's my next project. And Adam, what are you working on next?
I asked Francis not to ask that because I have no visual to show. I have something that I'm working on, but I think that's not the question that I asked you not to ask. I think I asked you not to ask me how I balance between writing my own books and then working on my full-time job because I'm not balancing. And that's why I don't have any visual to show, even though I am working on it. I am working on the next book for Yumi Friends and Family series. So in that book, actually, Yumi goes to her cousin's tour party, 1-year-old birthday in Korean culture. And it was really interesting because, Francis, you also said that you wrote a story of Thor.
That is one of the stories I'm working on.
Right. So,
yeah.
I was hoping, maybe we could publish at a similar time and do the book events together.
That would
Since
be
I'm not really
so
working
fun.
on it either, it's gonna take a long time. And
In 10 years, we'll see you back
let's
here.
say 5. Let's say 5. 10 is too
That's
long.
in 5.
So that's what I'm working on, and hopefully I do balance my work a little better.
So
and then
much
get
going
it out.
on that it's incredible. But I think we'll open up to questions from the audience if you have any.
Yes, if you have any questions, you can raise your hand and we'll bring the mic to you. But I'm going to start with questions that came online from our online viewers. There are a lot of people asking about how do you start your career as a picture book writer? If you don't have an agent, if you have not previously published, what do you do? How do you get people's attention so that you can do what you guys are doing?
It's very easy. Get a job in publishing and then write an adult book first. No, it is a great question. I will ask.
You're passing
Adam
that on to me.
Definitely the difficult question.
It is.
The first step is join Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. I did a lot of research on the industry before I even started writing my book, and attending those conferences virtually was incredible. They have all these resources. They bring in editors and agents. Phoebe, my editor, did a presentation at one of them, and that's why I asked my agent to submit to her specifically. So that's a start.
Yeah, I think that is actually the right answer to give because that's really the starting point. I mean, there are so many ways to go, but then when you are really starting, it's really daunting, where to start, what do you do? But the organization Francis just mentioned, scbwi.org, so that is Society of
Children's Book Writers and Illustrators.
Thank you. Oh, that's such a long acronym. So yeah, they have all the resources to start with. They have the list of publishers and agents. They have workshops. They do have tons of workshops for all different levels. So that is really a great way to start.
And I believe some or publishing houses also accept unagented submissions for children's books. So you'd have to Google that.
A lot of research does go into it, yeah.
And then I also have a very specific question about the Goblin Twins from Lori, who asks, Toki has 3 books. Did you have 3 particular books in mind? If so, what are they?
Oh, they are long lost to history, but I am sure they were incredibly adventurous books for the time.
So that's actually another favorite part of mine. I know, like I say, every page is my favorite, but like, please bear with me. So Toki has 3 books specifically, and I actually like, really looked at the cover of the books that Toki had, like what these books are about. And then one of them has mountains, another one has a swallow, the bird, another one. This was a little hard to tell, but this is another animal. So I actually really loved. Oh, like what did Jamie think of like when she had a prompt that Toki had 3 books? And I really love that he only has 3 books. So
So details make the setting and the character. I talk about it with my students all the time. So 3 very specific choice.
Then there's specific questions for Aram. Why did you decide to make your hero, sort of the heroine, I guess, Yumi, a cat? And why do there are a lot of children's books that uses animals as characters and they are anthropomorphized? What is the reasoning behind that?
so there are actually many reasons, and there is more sophisticated and mature reason. But and I have said this like in many events. Oh, like that's because it's more accessible. But to be very honest with myself, I like drawing animals. And I think it really came down to it. And at some point, I realized I should just admit that I just love drawing animals. And that's why. And when I was drawing this book, I had a cat, and I was drawing cat like every day all the time because they're so funny. They are just so funny to look at. So if I had a dog, I think my character would have been a dog. And if I had a hedgehog, like it would have been a hedgehog. But yeah, I think in the end, I think I made it cat because I had a cat and I was drawing it a lot. So yeah.
And I think going back to the earlier question of how you can be published, it is a combination of what you love to do and what you do best, and at the same time researching and thinking hard about what story you can bring that no one else can bring. And that's a combination of what you're interested in and what your history has been and what you're able to do in terms of presenting character that is only specific to you.
I really love that answer because I think there is a common question that I hear a lot, like what's the trend of publishing? Like what should I work on? Like there are like so many unicorns. Should I like work on a unicorn book? Or is it too late to work on a unicorn book? And I do believe that like don't think of a trend, like do what you do best and do what you want to do because trend does change very quickly, and picture book especially takes a really long time even after you sell it to a publisher. So but by the time the book is out, if you follow the trend, that trend is over. So I do think that it really has to be something that you really really love and something that you know the best. So I really agree with you.
Oh, for the camera, of course. Can I ask you, because so much thought has gone into your books, both of you, and you talked about the importance of research, and clearly Francis loves to research. Um, so that's making me wonder, what does the neighborly ghost signify? Because when I came across that page, I just wondered, what is the meaning behind this ghost? It's also neighborly from down the block.
Right. So for me, it was a way to, since they're mythical creatures from Korea, and their story is kind of happening separately from the human history of Korea. So when they come over to the West and to New York, I wanted them to encounter the equivalent from the mythical creatures of New York, and so they're kind of meeting at the same plane on the plane of myth in New York City, and then I think it was just such a fun. They exemplify a lot of the ghost characters we've seen throughout,
They have tea
American
together.
lore, the ghosts. So thank you. that question. Hmm. Yes. What? Yes.
Hello. Sorry if you answered this in the very beginning, but who did you write the book for, and why did you write them?
So for me, I wrote it for my, not necessarily my children, because I feel like they go often to Korea and encounter Korean culture very, immediately in their lives. But for, I think, people with children who don't necessarily encounter a lot of happy stories that introduce cultural elements um, of Korean culture. So I wanted a book that I could bring to the classroom and bring to a birthday party, uh, and they would be introducing. I think my children are the only Korean students in their grade, my older one anyway. And so being able to talk about Korea and add that cultural element to the discourse. Because I think the way that history and culture is taught in the American classroom, which it should be because we're in America, I guess, but it's very European history actually. So if all the mythology that you encounter, the history, even history. For example, the printing press, Gutenberg, regarded as the first printer. If you go to the East, obviously the East will say we printed first. China, Korea was printing a century before Gutenberg. So it depends on where you are. Your understanding of history and culture is very different, and I want to bring that in. And that's also a large part of how looking at New York from an immigrant from Korea's perspective is different from what you might expect from an American-centric point of view, where New York is the most busy city. And my joke in there is, oh, after Seoul, New York is so spacious and leisurely. The streets are so wide. That was a joke that I put in there just to show the difference of perspectives. And that's what I want to bring to my readers.
I think that was similar to me too. So the very first book that I did was called The Cat on the Bus. And when I was making that, I actually didn't have anyone that I was thinking of as a reader. But when I did my second book, No Kimchi for Me, I did want to make a book about the Korean element that is just so normal in everyday life, not as something big to really focus on, but that's something in your life because that's what it is for many people. And it was really interesting because I do see how things are changing, and with the older generation, for example, I didn't grow up in the States, but then my cousins who grew up in the States, they didn't grow up speaking Korean. But then when I see their children, they grew up speaking Korean, and then they having this Korean culture as a normal thing. It's just their thing. They don't even think about it. So I wanted them to see that in a book too, that they just see it as an everyday thing in a book to show
Not a
their
big deal.
classmates.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
It just
Yeah,
is.
so that they can actually show that to their classmates, to their friends. Just oh, it's there. Yeah, that's what I eat. That's what I do. So that was kind of similar approach.
Aren't illustrators. I'm just curious about when there's a manuscript. It seems like from Francis's slides, you had many visuals that was it after you submitted this manuscript, or was it simultaneously that you had these ideas about the illustrations, and how much detail went into the story? And from Aram's perspective, you've seen many manuscripts because you work on the art, and so what have you seen? I'm very curious about that. And my last question is, do you have plans to have a Korean version of these books released? Because that would be wonderful, I think.
So in the process of me working in a publishing house, so after the editor acquires the text, then we receive, like, designers receive the text, and then, like, designers and editors, we talk about the vision of the story, what kind of style do we want to go with, like, are there any artists that we want to pitch the project to, and we compile the list of illustrators that we want to approach to. And sometimes their cultural background does come in. For example, like, Jamie Kim knew all about dokkaebi already, so that, like, Francis didn't need to explain every single detail. So sometimes when we work on a manuscript that's very specific to certain cultural background or other elements, then sometimes we look into that as well. And once we sign up the illustrator, we just wait and see. And that's a really exciting part, because I don't know what I'm going to see. And I really love that part, because, so when we get the first round of sketches or the character studies, then we see, oh, this is how this illustrator interpreted this text. And then it can go in so many different ways. If some other illustrator illustrated this, then dokkaebis would look totally different. So that's what I really love about. And then, do you want to add anything to it?
I mean, for me, since I was introducing the concept of dokkaebi to people who would not be familiar with dokkaebi in terms of the editors, I was providing visuals of how dokkaebi were depicted in Korean folklore. But in the actual pages of the manuscript, I would, and this is discouraged by some editors, but put in visual cues about, like, I want, I don't know, 설릉, for example. They moved to 설릉, specifically 설릉, and explaining kind of the reason why I want that in there. So yeah, at every point, I think it really depends on the work, since I was introducing such a new concept.
I think a lot of times, so like that case, when you think of very specific thing, then we do actually go back to the author for visual references. And for the nonfiction books too, because as you saw how Francis did the research, authors go crazy with their research. And illustrators do their research too, of course, because they do want to do the accurate depiction of whatever they are doing. But then a lot of times, by the point that the text is acquired, like, authors do so much research, sometimes we go back to them and say, hey, can you help us out with the reference that you already collected? Like, is this accurate? Like, is this what you're envisioning? So it is a very collaborative process, which is also why I love working on picture books. And for your last question, I don't have any plan to publish in Korean, because no one seems to be interested. So that's why. But I would love to. But I think the Goblin Twins,
Currently on submission to Korean publishers. So, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Francis and Aram, for this wonderful conversation. As we mentioned earlier, they'll be signing their books, so please stick around, and maybe say hello. But thanks again, and congratulations.
Thank you so much for having us.
thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming.